Let me welcome you all to the colloquium on the subject of Gulf oil spill. This is jointly sponsored by the College of Engineering and the Honors College. My name is Ashok Saxena, and I'm the Dean of the College of Engineering, one of the co-moderators of this symposium. And the other co-host for the colloquium is Professor Bob McMath, who's the Dean of the Honors College and a Professor of History. I'd like to begin by just making some brief remarks about the sequence of events, and then I will introduce the very distinguished panel that we have, and we will start with our panel discussion. The main purpose of the colloquium is to raise the awareness among the university community about the recent catastrophic event. We plan to discuss multiple aspects of the event and its consequences. I will begin by making some very initial remarks to highlight pertinent information. Basically, the information is going to be mostly factual as we know it today. We do understand that the information that is being collected, it changes the scenario every day. In fact, this morning, the Today Show had a segment on some new findings that have come about on when people knew about certain things. So if that information had come out, I'm sure that would have impacted some of the comments that you would hear from the panelists. But basically, factually, what we know is that at approximately 9:49 p.m. on April 20th, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon rig located in the central Gulf of Mexico exploded, and 11 workers perished in the accident. And oil continued to gush into the Gulf waters for several months after the accident, causing an ecological and economic disaster of an unmatched proportion. The operators of the rig, BP, engaged several experts, including their own in-house experts, to investigate the accident. The findings were released in a report published by BP on September 8, 2010, and this report is available on the web for anybody who wants to get a copy of it. According to the report, the following sequence of events contributed to the accident. The cement barriers to isolate the flammable hydrocarbons did not work. The investigation team concluded that there were weaknesses in the cement design and testing, in quality assurance, and in risk assessment. The shoe track barriers meant to keep the hydrocarbons from getting into the well did not function properly. The negative pressure test designed to detect leaks in the cement barriers did not yield good results. The transoceanic rig crew and the BP site managers reached the incorrect conclusion that the well integrity had been established. Now, these are all BP's findings. The influx of flammable hydrocarbons was not recognized until they already were in the risers of the well. Well-controlled response actions failed to regain control of the well. Diversion of the mud gas separator resulted in gas venting into the rig. The hydrocarbons migrated beyond areas of Deepwater Horizon that were electrically insulated to areas where the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system probably transferred the gas-rich mixture into the engine rooms, causing at least one engine to go on overspeed, creating a potential for source of ignition. The emergency modes available to the operators did not seal the well. So those were the 8 things that this report basically formulated for the people to read. And if you look into it, this is not a very good report on the things that the BP team was able to handle. So the team basically did not identify one single action or inaction that caused the accident. There were a series of interlinked events, including mechanical failures, human judgments, suboptimal engineering design, deficient operational implementation, and poor teamwork that came together to initiate the explosion and subsequently escalate the consequences of the accident. So at the face value, it seems that even though information is tentative and may change in the future, the tragedy is one that may have been prevented. So that's the opinion that I have out of reading that report. Now, to put things in perspectives, I would say that we know that there are risks involved when we operate any machinery, even if it is a steam turbine that sends electricity down your homes, or airplanes, or even automobiles, or for that matter, even gas stoves. So one can take a very cynical view and say the safest thing is to do nothing. The other extreme is that you have poor design and operational negligence leading to unnecessary failures. So obviously we want to be somewhere in between the two. And we understand that safety features and equipment come at a cost, and there is trade-off between cost, performance, and safety. For accidents with such huge consequences, the risk tolerances should not only be low, the number of safeguards should be such that the damage to human life, property, and environment in the case of an accident is minimized. To discuss all this, we have a very distinguished panel amongst us. As one of the co-moderators, I will introduce the panel and have them address the first couple of questions. And then I will pass the panel moderator's role to Professor Bob McMath, who will pose the next few questions and will also manage the question and answer session with the audience. So be thinking about questions. We will come back to you and have an opportunity, give an opportunity to you to ask the panel some questions. Now for the introductions, Ralph Martin is the former chairman of PetroFac, located in Tyler, Texas. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in chemical engineering from the University of Arkansas and founded PetroFac in 1981. The company is a full-service engineering, fabrication, and construction contractor specializing in the design of hydrocarbon processing plants. It provides facilities to the oil and gas production and processing industries and currently employs more than 12,500 personnel operating from more than 25 offices around the world. PetroFac has offices in London, England, Sharjah, United Arab Emirates, Mumbai, India, and many other countries, and has designed and built plants in over a dozen foreign countries. Ralph Martin retired as the chairman of the company in November 2004. He serves on the University of Arkansas College of Engineering Advisory Council, as well as the University of Arkansas Board of Advisors. He holds 3 U.S. patents and was inducted into the University of Arkansas Engineering Hall of Fame in 2003. He was also an inaugural inductee in the Arkansas Academy of Chemical Engineers in 2005. The Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Arkansas is named after him in recognition of his philanthropic gift to the university. So please help me welcome Ralph Martin. Our second panelist is Marty Matlock, who is a professor in the Department of Biological and Agricultural Engineering at the University of Arkansas. He investigates the impact of human activities on ecosystem services with a focus on watershed-level impacts on water resources, nutrient transport, primary production, benthic biodiversity, and riparian function. So in his answers, he's going to explain what all that means. He uses systems models and life cycle analysis to identify causal relationships in complex ecological systems. Marty has degrees in soil chemistry, plant physiology, and biosystems engineering from Oklahoma State University. He is a registered professional engineer and a certified senior ecologist. He is a technical advisor to Keystone Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. He chairs the technical committee for development of the American National Standards Institute's Standard for Sustainable Agriculture and works with Stewardship Index for Sustainable Crops. Marty is the former president of American Ecological Engineering Society and a negotiator and a facilitator of water disputes between the Palestinian, Israeli, and Jordanian governments on behalf of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In addition, Marty is a sustainability strategy advisor for 6 international companies and an environmental protection commissioner for the Cherokee Nation. He is an author of Swimming Upstream, Collaborative Approaches to Watershed Management, published by MIT Press in 2005. So please welcome Marty Matlock. Our third panelist is Professor Steve Sheppard, who is the William H. Enfield Professor of Law in the School of Law at the University of Arkansas. Steve Sheppard teaches international and environmental law, constitutional law, legal history, and jurisprudence, property, remedies, and other common law courses. He is a member of the graduate faculty in political science, the core faculty in public policy, and the advisory faculties for European Studies and the King Fahd Center for Middle Eastern Studies. He has taught in New York University's Global Law School program, and he has lectured or presented in China, England, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, and Sweden. He's a faculty advisor to International Law Society, the Journal of Islamic Law and Culture, the Environmental Law Society, and the HLA Heart Society. His public service includes enlistment and commission in the U.S. Coast Guard Reserves and membership in the Iraq Advisory Group of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. He practiced law with Phelps Dunbar in its Louisiana, Mississippi, and London offices, and served as a law clerk to the U.S. District Judge William Barber and to U.S. Appellate Judge Grady Jolly. A member of the bar in Mississippi, Sheppard continues to consult and advise charities and governmental agencies. He's a member of the American Law Institute and a master in the American Inns of Court. His first degree is in political science from the University of Southern Mississippi. He holds a Juris Doctor and a Master of Laws from Columbia University and holds a post-JD certificate in international law from the Parker School of International and Comparative Law at Columbia. He was made a Master of Letters by Oxford University and a Doctor of Science of Law by Columbia University. So let's welcome Steve Sheppard. So I've done enough talking. It's time to ask the first question, and I'm going to address it to Mr. Ralph Martin. Mr. Martin, if you would provide your views of the chronology of events leading to the disaster and also provide some statistics on how many of such offshore wells are active around the world, and what % of the world's oil supply depends on the offshore deepwater oil reserves. Do you have any comments on how safe is the process of underwater drilling? In other words, how likely is it that such accidents may happen again elsewhere, either in coastal United States or in other places around the world? So these are a bunch of questions. If you want to take them one at a time, that's fine.
Well, the one report thing that the BP report did not address, I guess this worked, yeah. Is that they didn't use the recommended number of centralizers in the well. And when you drill the hole, it's not perfectly up and down, but the pipe is straight and the hole may not be. So they put centralizers on the casing to make sure there's room around the casing for the cement to set. And for some reason, BP, to save a little money, the guy on the rig didn't use the recommended number of stabilizers that Halliburton had recommended. I don't really know why they were using this nitrified cement. I guess, again, that's a cost-saving one. I don't see any advantage to having lightweight cement on this. It's used in some buildings to keep the weight down. But Halliburton claimed, I think, that they had used this formula on like 279 offshore wells. I think there's something like 3,400 wells in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is the first major accident, so the safety record is pretty good, but it's catastrophe when it does fail. And there's about at least this failed up through the casing, which again is normally if they have a blowout, it's through the annulus, and cement hasn't filled the void there. But and there's cement that should have stopped it. There's 2 check valves in the shoe, and there's double blowout preventers on this. So they had at least 5 things that went wrong to let the well blow out. And one of the things that kind of puzzles me is they drilled 2 relief wells. Why they didn't go ahead and complete one of those wells as a producer? Because it obviously found a major oil reservoir. And the deep waters is where most of the future oil is going to be found. They're drilling. Petrobras is the first one that started producing from these deep waters, and they found some tremendous reservoirs in off the shore of Brazil, and there are a number off the coast of the U.S. Exxon, Royal Dutch, Conoco, who else? There's 4 of them. Have anyway volunteered to spend $1 billion to build a rapid response equipment and team, and it would handle up to 100,000 barrels of oil. And I don't know. I would think surely this offer will be accepted. There's been a ban on offshore drilling since this happened. It's just released, but the regulations are not, I think, clearly defined and are going to be difficult to adhere to. There are different ways you can drill these. Well, Exxon in Saxena Island, instead of, there's a lot of problems with ice there, for instance, a platform or something. They're drilling wells 5 miles out in the formation from onshore. So the wells are actually onshore, but abduction is up to 5 miles offshore. And that has just started in production. There's deep water exploration going on off both coasts of Africa. Brazil, as I've said earlier, is the biggest place. And then there's quite a bit in the Gulf of Mexico. Chevron has found several fields there. And there are several fields that are now producing. Is there anything else?
Well, do you have a perspective on the leak test that they did with releasing the pressure in the well, and how is that something that is a very reliable test that if the data had been interpreted right, this could have been avoided?
I think so. I think from what I know about it, and I'm not an expert in that area by farming, is that it should have set off some questions in people's minds.
Okay. I know that we have some chemical engineers here in the crowd. Is anybody else in the audience willing to take a shot at adding anything to what Mr. Martin has already said? Buddy, where are you?
Well, to me, it's pretty obvious. I guess industry standards were not foremost in BP's mind. If as Mr. Martin has indicated, just in the flow of the oil down the annulus and then back up into the casing through the shoe, and you have a failure of 5 different things in a series. You would think somehow enough testing and enough being alert, you would realize that that one of those 5 would have been functioning, and so it sort of really does create some red flags.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's clear from the report as well as from what was said by Mr. Martin that there were things that could have been done differently that would have avoided this catastrophic event. And even when it happened, if certain safeguards were in place, perhaps the damage could have been contained much more than it actually was. So having said that, I guess what has happened has already happened. So I'm going to move to the next topic, which is to explore the environmental damage. Yes.
Before you leave that, though, could I ask
Absolutely.
Mr. Martin, of the 3,400 wells that are currently operating offshore, how many of them that you know of are in deep water, and how many are currently, what do you think is the prospect for further deep water development? Most of those are on the continental shelf. How many are deep?
That's right. Most of them are in shelf. There are I don't know, something like maybe 15 deep water, and most of them are either what they call a tension leg or a spar design. And a tension leg is they make it so the platform is buoyant, and then they have cables going to the ocean floor to anchor it, so that it's actually not supported. It's supported by the water, but the tension legs hold it there. And these things, you think of a cable or something, but sometimes they're like 6 foot diameter pipe.
Right.
And they also have a spar design, which to me is kind of like a beer can at the top, again, which has tension legs on it. And I know one that's at least, I think, 120-foot diameter. And they have production equipment inside the can as well as on the platform that sits on top of it.
But my understanding is that there really aren't but a couple of dozen that have been designed and implemented on both of those designs, at least so far. Is that about right, or is that old news?
I think that's pretty close.
Okay. So let's explore the environmental damage. I'm going to rely on Professor Marty Matlock to kick off that discussion. And the reason he is on the panel is because I asked him this question about 2 months ago. And the answer that he gave me was one of the most uplifting news that I got out of this whole mess. So what is the extent of the damage to the ecology of the Gulf, and how long might it take for everything to become normal? What are some of the significant long-term effects on the ecology due to the spill and the dispersants used for the cleanup? Can you make any comparisons between this spill and the one from Exxon Valdez that happened more than 20 years ago?
That's a pretty wide range of questions.
Yes.
So let's start with the second one. Can this system recover? Ecosystems don't recover. Ecosystems restore function. But you can never go back home again. Once something happens to an ecosystem, it's different, and that's the nature of things. There's one constant in all ecosystems, and that's changed. So it's not that that's bad or good, it just is. So the system will not recover into what it was. It will recover to something else that may very well look exactly like it was, but there will be residues of the event in the nature of the species that exist there, or the reactions to future events. And we can set that aside for now, but just to make it clear, ecosystems are never return to where they were before an event. They have systemic memory. Now, the Gulf Coast, as we know, is a unique coastal ecosystem. We have at least 8 explicit coastal fringe ecotypes within the ecosystem, ranging from fine sandy beaches that we're all familiar with for their value for ecotourism or for recreational tourism, to wooded swamps, which are primary habitat for many endangered species, and everything in between, which provide a whole suite of ecosystem services. This summer, I had a National Science Foundation research experience for undergraduates team working with me, including a high school student and 2 undergraduate students, who evaluated estimated the cost of ecosystem services loss associated with the spill. Now, the spill was still ongoing till the end of July, so it was a moving target for us. So we developed the mechanism for the analysis during that process, and then we were able to benchmark based upon about a July 24th impact effect and estimate the cost. Now, our primary estimate of the loss of ecosystem services, using 4 primary ecosystem services, like fisheries, which are non-recreational or commercial fisheries, recreation tourism, bird watching, and recreational fisheries would be the second, and nutrient cycling and flood control. Those were the primary ecosystem services we evaluated, a relatively conservative estimate of them, and we use literature-based values based upon replacement costs of those services. That is what you would have to pay, or what the equivalent loss of that would mean in terms of real dollars to somebody. So it's a relatively conservative estimate of the cost, too. Our estimate and we propagated uncertainty with the system by bracketing our lower and higher estimates and propagating uncertainty using distributions of those estimates. We are 95% confident that the loss of ecosystem services this year will exceed $8 billion. 95% confidence that they're greater than $8 billion this year, and over the next 10 years will exceed $12 billion. Will be $12 billion or greater, based upon those relatively conservative estimates. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. Remember, BP set aside a $20 million direct economic impact fund. So 20 billion, right, with a B. We estimated the total loss this year would be $8 billion, and over 10 years would be $12 billion. Why the difference? Because this is a subtropical to tropical ecosystem. Unlike the Exxon Valdez, which was in a subarctic ecosystem, we have the value of temperature here. It's a very warm system, and it also happens to be very nutrient rich. I went in early July to see the system, to see to the Gulf Coast, Mississippi and Florida, just to do some reconnaissance myself and see what the beaches were still like, show my kids what the beaches were like in anticipation that they wouldn't be very nice over the next 4 or 5 years. And I was surprised that the biggest impact I saw was from algae associated with nutrient enrichment with economic development and tourism over the last 5 years in the Gulf Coast, not associated with oil. So now the good news is microorganisms, if they have a lot of carbon, need nitrogen and phosphorus in order to metabolize that. All living things need those primary nutrients. They also need oxygen. That's the bad news. The good news is there's plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Gulf Coast for these microorganisms to assimilate that carbon. The bad news is there's not enough oxygen. So what that means is the oxygen, with this increase in carbon, organic carbon as a food supply for microbes, we've already seen a significant drop in oxygen levels throughout the water column. This is also different from the Exxon Valdez in the sense that the Exxon Valdez was a light sweet crude. What was it, sweet crude? It was a light crude at least. I'm misusing that term. It wasn't a sweet crude, was it? Sweet crude meaning high benzene content?
Well, sweet crude means it doesn't have H2S.
Okay, so that's...
And I think the North Slope would be considered sweet crude.
Okay, so it was a light, but it was a surface spill, and it was distributed predominantly on the surface, and it hit the beaches on the surface, rocky beaches. And of course, the best thing we could have done for restoration of that ecosystem would have been to add nitrogen and phosphorus and let the bacteria do their things. But we didn't. We tried to steam clean them, which killed all the bacteria, which was not a very smart thing to do. It made great television, but horrible ecosystem restoration. In this case, we did similar stuff. The best thing we can do for this ecosystem in many respects now is let it restore itself. There's not much you can do now that the oil has stopped beyond letting it restore itself. The good news also is that we estimated roughly 90% of the oil would be metabolized, is the word I'm using crudely, but would be processed through the ecosystem and reduced to smaller and smaller fractions, at least on the near shore, near coastal areas where there's adequate oxygen and mixing within the first year. That's based upon our experience with the Ixtoc rig in Mexico, 20 years ago, when it had not nearly as catastrophic, but a spill in a similar ecosystem. And in fact, all evidence suggests that that was an appropriate estimate. Using an exponential decay, then you start with a fairly high impact and it goes away fast, first year. So that means my guess is in the next year or two, it's going to be hard to find physical evidence of this catastrophe on the surface. What makes this complicated is it was 4,900 and some feet down. And that means that the oil was emulsified by the time it reached the surface, generally anyway, and it was certainly the dispersants added to that distribution in the water column. That's not something we have a lot of experience with, so estimating the impact of that ecologically is going to be difficult. Certainly there were local impact on fisheries, the local impact on mammals, aquatic mammals. The good news is it's a big ocean, a really big ocean, even the Gulf of Mexico. And it circulates. That water isn't very static, even the deep water. And so that means that dilution may be the solution to some of this pollution. That's not a bad thing because concentration, dose makes the toxin as well. Low doses results in less toxicity where the petrochemicals are toxic. And there are plenty of microbes who are perfectly happy to consume the petrochemical compounds so long as they have adequate nitrogen, phosphorus, and oxygen, among other things.
So in your economic model, where was the cost? What was the
The predominant loss of ecosystem services that had the highest value were the commercial fisheries and the ecotourism and recreational tourism. They're obviously the highest value per unit time, per unit area systems. Now, we estimated impact based upon each of those 8 different coastal fringe types and based upon proximal tidal zones, because that's how the oil gets mixed in on the near shore effect. We didn't go beyond near shore for ecosystem services loss. It's a very conservative estimate, but based upon our standard approach to ecosystem services impact, it's a consistent methodology.
Okay. Well, anybody else want to jump into the discussion?
Well, I'm kind of curious, Marty. One of the things that I found, I was working in the Gulf on a related project at the same time with a lot of the BP engineers and with some of the coasties. And one of the things that was really unnerving in talking with both the federal engineers and the private engineers is that no one had a model of where the oil was going. There were constant arguments over what's happening with the cargo as it's moving around the sea. Mm-hmm. And part of the problem is that this is even though we know a lot about this type of production, we don't know a lot about this type of production in high pressure environments. And so with the oil coming out at that depth, they really didn't know what was happening, and this led to an awful lot of difficulties in crafting a response, because you need to be able to, there's an awful lot of equipment, and there are an awful lot of people that have to be put in place before something happens in order to be able adequately to respond, and yet we didn't know where to put them. Because nobody had modeled this. There wasn't anything anybody had agreed on. We didn't have enough imagery from past bills, anything like this scale. No, it just hadn't happened before. So there were basically 2 major camps. One of them said the oil's going down. The other one said the oil's going up. Mm-hmm. And the response was largely based upon the oil going up, because we could do something about that, and the fear was there's not much you can do about what the oil goes down with. And also, we didn't know what it would mean if the oil goes down. Now, in the middle of all this, because I used to work with a different type of oil spill from this, my suggestion was that it might do something that it looks like it kind of did do, and I'm really wondering if you found any evidence for this. I suggested that maybe both sides were right, that it would do something in the ocean a little bit like it does if you have a deep underground loss, that it would kind of do the natural fracking, so you'd get the distillates up on the surface along with some of the stuff more or less as an opportunity rise, and you get the tar down on the bottom, and you get everything else going where it hits equilibrium according to whatever the pressure is when the temperature are when it hits it, and you'd kind of get this weird dispersion up and down the water column until things get absorbed, get eaten up, and therefore we won't know for sure because no one was there to measure any of this stuff. But if that was what would be the case, ultimately, we're going to find some tar. Ultimately, we're going to find some spill in places we're not expecting it, because it does move around late, if that's what happened. But so far as I can tell, other than the Woods Hole guys, we don't have a lot of assets that are trying to track this on either of those models. Now, a lot of that project really sort of got wrapped up in the autumn. But I'm wondering, Ralph, because you've been thinking about what happens when oil moves around in towers more than any of us. And I'm wondering what you think of that idea, and also if you guys saw it.
I think you're right. One of the things that at the temperature in the bottom there, the gas forms hydrates, mm-hmm. which is a solid, and you don't hardly know what happens. And the first thing that BP tried, they put a dome over it, and it filled up with mm-hmm. methane hydrates. But yeah, I think there will be tar on the bottom. I think you're right. There'll be mm-hmm. some natural. And they burned it, and that would, I think, you would burn more of the light stuff than you would the heavy stuff, mm-hmm. and it would sink to the bottom. And I don't know that there's not much oxygen or much of anything there. It'll probably just stay there.
Mm-hmm. We don't know a lot about deep ocean ecosystems. We don't go there very often because it's awfully expensive and yep. difficult. And when we do go, those are anecdotal experiences. It's hard to imagine dropping a probe into the Amazon rainforest in 5 places across the entire rainforest and understanding that ecosystem. That's the same thing we have here. It's a huge place with very extreme conditions that we don't understand very well. We certainly don't understand the ecosystem functions there. So trying to anticipate the impacts would be outrageous. Now, I will suggest, we didn't collect any primary data. That's not what we do. We were relying on NOAA, and we were relying on University of New Hampshire, and we were relying on Woods Hole folks and others who were reporting data as they collected it to try to track and evaluate impacts. The data is still being analyzed. In fact, we just received some new data from the University of New Hampshire this week so that we can analyze the continuing dispersal and bioremediation of the system. And we're seeing again, the oil impacts are going away fast. The United States government reported that to the consternation of many ecologists. It was a horrendous catastrophe, but we got to take good news where we can. This is a warm water ecosystem on the surface, at least. Deep water stuff, I don't have a clue, and I'm not sure very many people do.
Okay, so if you were to summarize, and I'm going to put some words in your mouth, you think that in about 3 years' time, all the effects that are very visible effects will be all gone, and the system will not be restored, because that's not the word you chose to use, but it will have recovered.
That's my assessment.
Yeah, and the recovery is defined by it's going to go back to its steady state, which is the condition it would have gone to if the spill had not occurred.
It will return to a steady state that will approximate the pre-spill condition. But what's different is when you've disturbed a system like this, now you have a resident bacterial population that have seen a huge carbon source come in. So you hit them with a little bit more organic carbon, they can respond much faster because there are residual populations that can utilize that as an energy source now. That's good or bad. Ecosystems respond like any complex system with memories. So the real impact we'll see ecologically over the next 5 years is going to be suppressed oxygen levels in the near shore and farther away from shore ecosystems. The deep water systems are pretty anoxic to completely anoxic anyway. Yeah. And they're not really primary fisheries. It's the near shore stuff that matters most from an economic perspective.
Okay. And the role of dispersants, I guess you said that it's mostly in the deep waters, and you're not sure of what the long-term impact of that would be.
There's a lot of controversy about the role and use of those dispersants and their impact. And my comment earlier about steam cleaning the rocks in Prince William Sound, in my personal opinion, the dispersants were a bit of that. It's a way to remove the physical impact, which makes great television, and frankly, it alleviated some of that stress from in the political arena, more so than the ecological impact it had. It was awfully expensive, and I'm not sure that it had any particular ecological benefit. I don't think it had any harm.
But you don't think it would have any harmful effects?
The primary concern for harm is that you're creating smaller and smaller and more solubilized forms of organic carbons and the potential toxic effects on organisms that live there. But it's a big ocean, and dilution is an incredibly powerful thing when you have that much water.
Okay, I'm going to ask Bob McMath to come and continue the next two topics that we have on the agenda here.
Well, as Dean Saxena said, and I think several of our panelists have suggested as well, this is an ongoing story, and both the scientific information, the answers to scientific questions, and the questions about human organizations and activities which might lead us to some preventative things are still unfolding. And the example of the story yesterday out of the release of a letter from the chief investigator of the Presidential Commission involved with this about Halliburton's role and about the cement. I mean, that's one tiny bit of data that really the first thing that's come out of that commission. They'll hold their first public sort of hearings and pronouncements about things in a couple of weeks. And so all that is to say as we try to think about what happens next, that's fraught with danger. But that's why we're here, is to at least to have informed speculation about some of the human causes and what may happen next. So I want to start with a question which may be directed to Mr. Martin, but others may want to speak to this as well. In the past months, really, there's been a great deal of finger-pointing between BP and the firms it's contracted with, both in the drilling process with Transocean and very specifically in the cement mixture that was introduced into the well. And I guess the question is, when all is said and done, how do you think we should assess the responsibility between the principal firm here, BP, and at least the principal suppliers working with them, Transocean, who had the rig, and Halliburton, who was providing the cement mixture? Who can we say is responsible in all this?
I think the courts will be deciding that for years. I really don't know. Obviously, BP has the most responsibility, but I think there's enough to go around.
Ralph, could you say just a little bit, if this is something you have observed at least, in a drilling operation like this, what is the chain of command among these organizations? I mean, how should there be a sufficient flow of information up to BP that they can really know what's going on?
Well, normally the company will have somebody present that will approve or disapprove what they're planning to do. And the one thing that's not in the BP report, they didn't put the number of centralizers that Halliburton recommended, but that's not where it failed. It failed up the casing.
Anybody else want to sort of speak to this?
I just wanted to suggest that there really are two significant ways of looking at every single one of these systems. One of them is that it's an enterprise of the producer, of the BPs or the Exxons or the Shells of the world. And the other is that it's something that we're all doing, that it's an enterprise that people are doing. And that's where the regulatory responsibility and the administrative responsibility lies. So while things went wrong here, and I think that it's like many of these events where a complicated system fails, one failing alone will not cause the problem because of redundancy in the system. We know that there's a very great danger here. So we build systems with great redundancy, lots of oversight, and it takes a lot of things to go wrong. Regrettably, it's not uncommon for a lot of things to go wrong. And so even though we haven't seen something like this happen before, we can say with confidence, especially as systems age, the greater potential for material stress and for personnel relaxation increases the potential for systems to fail. The only way we can prevent that is with a combination of management, both by the producers and by the oversight agencies, that will prevent that. It takes people to prevent that. And generally speaking, it takes a variety of people who don't get along to do it. There's no way you can do this if
Spoken like a lawyer.
happy. And that's a part of the game that has to be maintained. And so while it's all right to say that BP might have done a better job, and it's all right to say that Halliburton or Transocean might have been a better job, the fact of the matter is 11 guys are dead here, and a lot of harm took place, and a lot of money was lost, and we all needed to do a better job. It's not just the companies, and the government has some burden here that it failed in. And that's something that we are responsible for in the democracy. And we can't just say, well, that company should have done better, because there's something we all know about how people do things. I would believe anybody who would say that I would never have let that happen if you can promise me you never have and never will exceed the speed limit when you drive on the highway. There are just too many reasons why we might slightly sneak on some standard that we know is there for our safety. And all it takes is a few sneaks in a row to go from being a little bit over the speed limit to a 5-car collision. And that's the same type of system. If you think of an interstate highway, it's a complex system of systems, just like every one of these deep oil rigs is. And we're going into a new area with a lot of new stuff. And one of the things that we have to do is do more planning, more training, and more oversight, working in a partnership between the government. And it is true, it'll go to the courts now, and that's a shame. We could have avoided that by doing better planning up front and better coordination up front between the agencies and the states and the United States as well, and those companies. And that's where I think we need to go from this.
So the follow-up question that plays off of the issue of how well organizations and human beings can abide by regulations or by agreed-upon standards in this case. And fairly or not, BP is in the crosshairs and is going to be examined very, very closely in the years and probably decades to come. And if you may recall that BP, as we now know it, is a pretty new thing. That is, it was a relatively small firm after it lost much of its holdings in the Middle East, and then about 15 years ago, with new leadership, very aggressively bought up major oil-producing companies, Aramco, Amoco, and some others, and tried to bring them into one big organization, which those of you who have managed big organizations know is a very complex and difficult thing to do with different corporate cultures. But so BP is in the crosshairs, and you probably remember from the summer when a group of CEOs of other major oil companies stood up before a congressional committee and swore to tell the truth, and all professed that BP had not followed industry standards in this particular situation. They said that, and what was in the back of some people's minds was a history of BP in the last decade or so, which had experienced a deadly fire at a refinery in Texas City, a major spill on the Alaskan North Slope, and the sinking of another platform in the Gulf in 2005. So the question I want to sort of grapple with for a minute is one about corporate culture, corporate way of thinking and way of dealing with issues. And so to what extent was the problem, the underlying problem here, somehow tied up with the corporate culture, the corporate way of doing things in BP? Or is that really not the issue? Is it something beyond that?
Well, the Texas City refinery, it was an Amoco refinery, and I expect most of the Amoco people were still there. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that BP's culture. My personal experience working with BP is they're very safe. They but I think in this case they had an individual that was trying to save some money, like on the centralizers, for instance. And the overall cost of the thing, it was insignificant, but that rig was probably costing like $500,000 a day, and saving a few hours is quite a few dollars, and that's what he was trying to do.
I teach ecological environmental risk assessment, and we evaluate case studies of environmental catastrophes that affect human health. Often we see these cascading failures I can't speak to the corporate infrastructure and culture that result in it, but I can address the issue of probability of cascading failures. It's the same issue we dealt with the loss of our two space shuttles. There's a perspective that extreme events don't occur, and that multiple extreme events never occur together. And that's just not true. They just occur together rarely, as Mr. Martin said. They don't occur frequently, 3,400 operating rigs in the Gulf, and we've not had an event like this. The Ashok is probably the most recent relatively high-profile event, so it's not a common thing. But it's not unprecedented. Given long enough, improbable things happen. The question you have is what circumstances do you have, as Steve indicated, what circumstances can you put in place to compensate for the trend of a cascading failure, to recognize it and intervene in some way. And the way we do this in a regulatory environment is we create this tension where you have a group who is overseeing another group. And many companies do the same thing internally, where you have tensions between them. Those tensions often result in inefficiencies. Inefficiency costs money. So the question is, how do you manage risk in that complex environment? It's not easy, and we don't get it right a lot.
And I'd say, too, that even though we haven't had an event like this before, we've had a ton of near misses. And there are a lot of little spills. There are very few rigs that have never had a bit of cargo loss somehow. And sometimes it's as simple as Bob forgot to shut off the valve before Sam flipped on his, or a switch was malfunctioning, or a light was off. Things happen. It's really complicated. It's very dangerous. It's very noisy. You get a bit of weather. Things go wrong. And most of the time, most of you guys have been in tense situations where you're working with people and something you start to do wrong, someone stops you. That's how life is in almost every one of these environments. And so the vast majority of the time, the guys rally around, they fix the problem, and basically they get past it. But it's rarely you're going to have a big something this complicated with high-pressure, dangerous stuff around, and you don't have problems. The good news is the problems are normally there in a way that people can solve them, and the horrible thing is when the problem takes place in a way that people either don't have enough time or don't have enough tools to solve them like they did here, but that's bound to happen sometimes. So normally you lose a couple of thousand gallons, and then you get into the barrel game, and then you get into the send the freighters, Bob, and get the booms out. But we all have ways of solving most of these problems, but sometimes they just get too big. And what we don't do often enough is learn from the small problems what the big problems look like. The other thing we don't do often enough is admit, as Marty was saying, that the big problems are going to be different, and we're going to need different tools. And while I admire the big companies for saying this is what we're going to do, I don't like it because it's nowhere near enough. It just isn't anywhere near enough. What they're not committing is sufficient research to know what will happen on these deep rogues. They're not testing them for severe failings enough. We're not getting the type of data to develop emergencies. And frankly, as much as I am troubled by the environmental hazards that these run, I am vastly more concerned for the men who are out there and have nowhere to go. A lot of my young life was spent dealing with what happens when a ship blows up and you're on it. This is the same problem but worse. And these guys need more protection than they're going to get when they're out there, and nobody has looked at the real catastrophe that could happen carefully enough to give them the protections they need both to prevent it and to survive it. And that's what I think that they need to be doing, and I didn't see that type of commitment come out this summer.
Question for Professor
I might just clarify, on those 3,400 platforms, there are over 30,000 wells that have been completed.
Right.
Show how rare an incident this is. But
Absolutely.
I have my comment. I think what we have in that situation is you have a combination of high risk, as you said, it's a complicated process. Besides that, you are going into the age where our technology is not there to face that kind of environment. And the other one that you have the judgment and how to manage that risk. And I could go in this blame game. The bucket could go around for a while, and there's going to be more money spent, and the lawyers are going to feed on that. But I think that the combination of those two factors, our technology and the changes that we are going to be doing now based on what we know, but we're not going to be able to do changes on the things that we don't know, trying to go even deeper and deeper. And the judgment, even though that people is maybe, as you say, they had near misses in the past. With that pressure and the pressure about being efficient, keeping costs down, people sometimes will do those misjudgments, and tragedies like this may happen again. It's sad to say it, but it had happened. In the oil industry, people recognize the risk or the danger they're facing. But sometimes, that pressure and our pressure for trying to keep finding oil, keep pushing them to take that risk, and they're going to be at that age that just one step forward and you are over the edge. You're going to be falling. I think it's going to be hard, but the only thing that we had to keep doing is we need to keep trying, trying to develop that technology and people to understand it, and that will be also for the engineering schools. How to educate our engineers and recognize that just because you have a near miss in the past, nothing's going to happen again. You're playing with the odds, and eventually maybe something be more severe than the previous event.
Let me just respond, and there's one other thing I wanted to respond to your specific question on that. I agree with you, and the technology will be a part of the solution, just as it's also a part of the risk. It gives us opportunities, and we want to exploit them. But the good thing about this, and also I wanted to respond to the BP problem, I don't think the BP has a cultural problem. I disagree with that hypothesis in the press. I think that is wrong. I've worked with a lot of BP guys up and down the chain of command, and I've always had better experiences at BP facilities than with I like those guys. I think that they're very professional. And I also think they're very safety conscious. Because one of the things that makes this work, and it's like the story on the rigs, little problems happen, and they're fixed by the people who are there. The problem comes when you get a series of events that exceed what they're capable of curing. And that's where better design is essential, and better tools are essential. But I believe very firmly that the reason why we have had so few events of any magnitude is that the people involved have been what have kept it from growing into greater problems. That the human factor, in fact, is not the weakness. In fact, it's the strength that has kept these systems as safe as they have been. But it depends upon training, it depends upon commitment, and it depends on the ethics of the people involved. One guy cut some corners here, but look at the thousands of guys that didn't. And that's essential to recognize. It depends on the people in the system. They're as essential as the technology.
Yes, I'm Jerry Havens, Chemical Engineering. I have a real short observation and then a quick question that anybody on the panel I'd like for anybody on the panel to address. On the observation, it's been pointed out that this is a work in progress, and if history tells us anything, will probably still be a great deal of attention being given to this in the investigatory sense 20 years from now. We've had a number of events that are major accidents, some going back, the first one that I've been working on, to 1974, Flicksborough, England. It is still being discussed in scientific conferences. So the question comes that I would like to point out that in the public's mind, this is largely viewed as a catastrophic oil spill, the worst that's occurred. I'm interested in the fire and explosion aspects associated with the accident. There is very little that has been decided about that. And I guess my question is, does anybody have an opinion as to what the proximate cause of the catastrophic failure and sinking of the rig was? I don't think it was an oil spill.
I don't know what caused the rig to sink. If you gasify the water, it lightens it and it won't support where it sunk, or where the explosion caused something that caused it to sink. I really don't have enough information to have an opinion.
Yes. Well, thank you for that answer. And I guess I would just point out that in addition to all the other questions that are still extant, this is one of them that will be very important for the technical people to sort out, because it's only then that you can really start to rationally think about how you could have prevented it.
My grandfather used to test submarines. That was what he did. He'd be the guy that captained the shakedown cruise on new submarines. And he used to say it's very important not to let too much water in the people tank. And somehow gas got in the people tank here, and it shouldn't have been there. We don't know quite how yet, but we really need to find that out.
Yeah, the point that I really would like to leave is, if the rig had stood and there had not been an explosion, it probably would have been a far simpler question to handle.
Thank you. That's a key point. Let me ask one more question that takes us in a slightly different direction, and then open up for comments, questions from everybody. But we've talked a lot about corporate action and corporate responsibility. This is also a regulated industry with several decades of regulation of safety issues. And just as corporations have come in for some hard questions, so has the regulatory body involved here, an arm of the Department of Interior, which seem to be less interested in safety than expanding production as rapidly as possible. And there's some other very unsavory aspects to their behavior, which I won't go into. But you've got problems certainly on the regulatory side here. And the question here is, assuming that we will continue to have safety regulations of some type with governmental oversight, is it possible, is there a way for federal regulatory bodies and sort of self-regulating corporations to collaborate and create a safer environment? Is that possible to do?
There has to be inherent in an effective process that is self-regulating, an adversarial relationship between the regulated and regulator. You can't have a collaborative relationship and a regulated environment. What you have in a collaborative relationship is a collaborative relationship. And that's perfectly good for some applications. But if you have an enforcement process, you have to have a regulated and a regulator relationship, and that requires adversarial, some sort of level of adversarialness. So that doesn't mean that you're bickering at each other. It doesn't mean it's irrational or even non-cooperative at some level of functionality. But somewhere, somehow, things have to be enforced. And that seems to have been a failure in this particular instance. It is often a failure because we humans like to get along, most of us. And if you have a group of people working together long enough, there's a tendency for the rough edges to smooth off, and people start working together, sometimes to the detriment of the system.
I think that the point is very well taken, Marty. At the same time, throughout the history of modern regulation of industry, you've had this situation where most of the crucial knowledge is in the possession of the companies, and somehow the regulators have to have access to that. Look at what is being done right now with Chevron testing this cement. So I think your point is well taken, but at some level, you have to have the people with the knowledge and the people who are doing the regulating, unless you're simply going to replicate the knowledge of the industry in an agency, which I don't think is going to happen, but I take your point.
Well, Ralph, I'm really curious, because you've dealt with regulators. Being among the regulated, how you feel about this?
Well, I think what happened in this case is, like, say, there are 30,000 wells and they hadn't had a serious accident, that everybody had just got complacent. And I think there's one inspector for 56 rigs. And I think they spend most of their time in the office and not on the rig. And so there really was very little inspection done.
I'd say there are two things. First, which is as much as I admire Marty's approach, I'm afraid it isn't. It won't work in one fundamental way. The government doesn't know anywhere near as much about what happens in a complex environment, and this is not just a problem with oil rigs. All you engineers out there, you're creating things the government has never seen before. And it becomes essential for the government to learn from the creators what they're creating. And it also becomes essential for the government to learn from the creators what to fear in what they're creating. And it's essential for the government to do certain types of forecasting with that knowledge provided. And so there's a symbiotic relationship that has to be there for every regulated industry and the regulators of that industry. Now, the creative tension you're talking about is very important, but I don't like to think of that as antagonism, but the usual creative tension that comes with people with different goals. Because the government will have to get better at, and these specialized agencies must get better at, asking the right question. And the most important question is, what can go wrong, and what do you want to do to keep it from going wrong, so that we can make sure not only that you, but also the next 10 guys who buy your products are doing what you tell us we need to make them do. The industry, in my experience, is very good at forecasting its greatest weaknesses, but what they need is help in making sure that the guys that are smart and know that have information provided to everybody so that we're all doing it in a smart way.
I'll accept implementation of competing goals as a definition of antagonism. That's fine.
We have a question or a comment right here, and after that, I'm just going to stand back. And we do have 2 hand mics, and if you have a question, I'll recognize you, and we'll get a mic to you.
I hope this is not a silly question, but I heard a number of the panelists talk about the large ocean, and it is a very large ocean. Also, there's an awful lot of oil reservoirs under that ocean. And I do know that a lot of those reservoirs do lose oil to the surface, and in this case, to the ocean. Do we have any, and I know this is man-made disaster and the largest we've ever had, but do we not have any natural occurring events that we could have gone to school on to determine these ecological effects that might occur for large amounts of oil being dispersed into the ocean over a long period of time?
I just don't think that it's been an adequately well-conceived situation or scenario. The risk was so low, there's no real precedent for it to invest resources necessary to investigate that scale of a catastrophe. That we know what happens to oil in the natural environment. We know what happens to human releases of oil and natural releases of oil in the environment under various ecosystems. So the question we had here was really, in my mind, really the human impact of more than the ecological impact of that scale. Now, human impact, I would say endangered species in many respects. As a systems ecologist, an individual species is not so relevant as the function or niche it occupies. Losing an endangered species is a catastrophe from a human perspective, but from an ecological perspective, something else will move in and take over that niche. So ecologically, as I indicated earlier, this is not, the impact was significant, was severe, but it didn't kill the Gulf of Mexico.
Question right over here.
My name is Brady Tackett. I'm a journalism student, and I'm more interested in the how this plays into the election cycle this year. I don't know if it's because of the economy the way it is, but it seems like these issues, environmental issues in general, have kind of fallen by the wayside. My question is for anyone who wants to answer it, but are these ever going to be, are environmental issues ever going to be the crux of who gets elected? Is it ever going to overpower other issues?
You're the political guy. I'm a damned engineer.
Yes.
So.
The answer is yes, but not soon. I think the easiest way to look at this is both from a perspective of American history and European practice. The United States had a brief period in the late 1960s and early 1970s in which environmental issues were extremely important on the national stage. We've also had a few periods and a few areas in which environmental issues have been extremely important in basically statewide, state-level, and regional elections, sometimes in which the environmental problem was very energizing to the anti-environmental cause, and sometimes when the environmental problem was very energizing to the environmental cause. But certainly enough to have influence on, say, senatorial, gubernatorial elections and more local elections. We haven't seen that on a national scale really since the 70s, but you have to understand we have a system now, a national system of environmental regulation, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, an awful lot of the things that have gone into the regulation of oil, that was all put in by a Republican administration that won a lot of its elections by championing green causes. Even though in recent years, and perhaps for some of the students this might be news, but environmental and ecology, environmental regulation is a Republican issue. Those are all Republican statutes on the books. And the parties now may be shifting their positions relative to that, but that is largely the result of that political pressure in the late 60s, early 70s that led to the enactment of all those laws. Most of them were passed from 1970 to 1974. So the odds that could happen again are very high. It normally takes a variety of problems. Now, to some degree, the environmental movement is a victim of its own success. You don't have lakes of fire and eagles dying out of the sky, and so people don't tend to take it so seriously. Al Gore can make his movie and win his prize, but then people will begin to spend money to counter that narrative, as they say. The Europeans have had a more enduring environmental movement that has been the foundation for several different political parties, have had more persistent effects. It's possible that that sort of response will happen in America, but it'll probably take place more slowly because the American two-party system is entrenched by laws created by the members of those two parties that make it more difficult for third parties that are driven by single issues to arise here. But it is possible, but more than likely it's going to take a crisis that lasts longer than 2 or 3 news cycles and is scarier to people in media areas like New York and California and Chicago for that really to take place. One of the problems is that no one really cares if there are a bunch of oily Cajuns. It's not the same as scaring a bunch of New Yorkers.
Steve's going to get himself in trouble here in a minute. As your counselor, I advise you to remain silent.
Well, Ralph, would you disagree with that analysis or what?
For the younger people, if you didn't catch his allusion to a Republican president, that was that great last liberal president, Richard Nixon, who oversaw much of that legislation in the early 70s. I think we have a question up here.
I'd like to talk some more about like the safety features of the well. I've heard some speculation, like on the news media and in the internet, that other wells in other countries like Britain or Norway have more safety features than wells in the United States. And I was wondering if our panel could maybe speculate on if there are such safety features and if any of those would have prevented a spill like this.
Not that I know of, really. They are much more inspected and regulated than we have been in the States. I think the pendulum will swing the other way, and the oil industry be more over-regulated. And
No safety features, just more inspection, you think?
well, they're going to require the tentative regulations they've come out with. I think the estimate is going to cost like $125,000 for all the engineering studies on blowout preventer. Well, and it has to be done on each well. Well, you know, you can do it on the blowout preventer and use it over and over. Just to throw in a comment, one of the things that we've done wrong in the nuclear industry, we should have approved a Plan A and a Plan B and a Plan C, and you can build one of those, and you don't spend millions of dollars on engineering and getting approval. In the original nuclear plants, apparently, I've read that the paperwork cost weighed more than the plant.
Well, there are differences between the substantive standards of our regulations and the European standards. And there are also differences in the production specs for facilities of all forms, not just deep water wells or anything. Oil transfer facilities probably cause, in sum, a lot more lost cargo than the production facilities, but for a variety of reasons. The funny thing about it is that you get different relationships between the industry and the government in different states, and so in some there's a more smooth relationship, in others there's more antagonistic, and ours has been fairly tame. I remember when I used to do facility inspections, we put in place a new regulation that required for a lot of connections where you'd take a big hose and buckle in basically faucets. You can think of it as big-ass large faucets. Lots of bolts. And we had these and there was a requirement that you'd build basically a steel box around it with no top, so that if there was some cargo lost through the connection, that the dam would catch the lost oil, and it could hold a couple of barrels inside it, and that was a very useful thing. It took about 5 years to get this in place because a variety of interested parties managed to control a variety of legislators to slow down just putting these things on. And they didn't cost a great deal of money to put in, and it didn't take a lot of effort or knowledge to do. But it did. In the end, it saved the industry a lot of money, because what we said is if you clean it up out of the box, it's not technically a spill. But if you let that much cargo go into the ground, it is a spill, and you have to notify EPA, and if EPA finds out you had the spill and you didn't, the fines are pretty high. And depending upon where it is, they either had to call us at the Coast Guard or they had to call EPA. And it saved them a ton of money once they put them in there, but they fought putting them in for 5 years because they didn't want to pay the welders to go around and buy the steel, and they just didn't want to do it. And it took every one of these connections out of use for about a half a day while they were putting them in. And so they came up with all sorts of reasons why it would cost them too much, would delay the use of these facilities for too long. And in the end, when they finally put them in, most of the guys admitted their life was a lot better and they were saving money by having them in there. Now, there are regulations that do cost a lot of money, and compliance is a real problem. But when done well, creative regulation both leads to greater efficiency and cost savings. But because we have a world in which every company that's regulated fears all the regulators, they tend to fight every one of them, and they need to pick their targets better.
I have a question right over here, and then...
Philip Kyle, I'm a chemical engineering student. My question is for the entire panel, and it kind of touches on technology and regulation. I had a question about, like you've stated before, we don't have a lot of the technology and the research on what happens on these deep water wells. And for example, Petrobras, I know, is aggressively expanding, and they're not necessarily having to go into the deeper waters. How much of a factor do you believe government policy and regulation that kind of has a culture right now of pushing farther and farther? You got to get the wells further and deeper out into this possibly happening in the future with different wells.
I'm not sure I understood what the question is. We are going out deeper, and what makes it even more tough in the Brazilian wells and a lot of our offshore, there's a salt layer they drill through, and that causes other problems.
Basically, I guess I was asking just how much a factor does government policy play into the fact that this might happen in the future, since we're pushing farther and farther out into the ocean? Is the likelihood of an accident such as this happening again increase because we're trying to push farther and farther out? We don't necessarily have the technology developed and the research in place of what's going to happen that far out in the ocean.
It definitely is more dangerous the deeper water you go. There's the outside pressure on all the equipment you've got down there. You normally don't think. I mean, it's easy to design a pipe to contain 3,000 pounds inside the pipe, but when you put 3,000 pounds per square inch on the outside of the pipe, you've got a different problem. And so this deep stuff, you're looking at that sort of thing. It's about 0.4 of a pound per foot of water is the pressure. But that's where the oil is, and that's where the effort's going to be. There's all kinds off both coasts of Africa. They're doing deep water. They're even doing some deep water exploration in the Black Sea.
Risk equals hazard times exposure. What you're describing is increasing exposure, increasing the number of the human activity in those extreme environments. And the hazard's pretty clear to us now. So the exposure is going to go up. Hazard's going to be there anyways. It's pretty static. So that means risk is going to go up. How do governments respond? Well, that depends on the governments are our surrogates for the commons. And so that's, whether that's good or bad, whether the government responds in a way that enhances safety or reduces access to the resource, those are tensions that we're dealing with in our politics body today.
We have a question right over here.
Well, it's clear to me that you need a behavioral psychologist on the panel. All engineering solutions are constructed by humans. They all ultimately fail. It is to be hoped that they'll be taken out of use or repaired or replaced before they fail. So what is the perspective within the domain of each one of you? There comes a point where you simply can't squeeze out mayhem, because there will always be humans there. See, this is a human failure. That's what you're saying. The cement was wrong, the gadgets didn't work, and so forth. But none of one of you mentioned really in any clear-cut way the human variable, which will always be there. Now, am I saying stop trying to keep accidents from happening? At some point, You just have to accept they will. They're gonna. And it's too expensive to try to keep squeezing mayhem out of the system. Anything you have to say about that?
I would just respond that our ability to manage risk is it's greater than our action of managing risk. That we understand the phenomena much better at some level than is reflected in the way we behave sometimes. And that's part of that systems failure we're discussing, where you just get comfortable with things. And this happens to NASA engineers. This happens.
Those who understand it are not the ones on the rig.
Well, and that is the human. That's the human component. Humans fail. There again, there's a question about how much risk is tolerable, and how do you communicate risk in a way that is going to be persistent in the human mind. Carl Sagan said we evolved to run from the tiger, not to see the cliff we're running towards. We respond to immediate threats. We don't deal, and systemic threats become part of the background noise in which we operate. We get in a car and we drive 75 miles down the road, and so we're inches from absolute catastrophe at any given moment, and yet we live with that every day. We don't deal with these systemic continuous risk in a way that's meaningful. That's the reason we have to implement policies and procedures that supersede human decision making on a day-to-day basis. That's why we have regulations, and that's why we have safety procedures and practices and double checks, and that's why we have 2 people with keys before we launch missiles. That's why we do things like that. But that's where we start talking about systemic failures too. Cascading failures are usually not big things. They're a whole bunch of little things.
But I want to put a pitch in for the human factor. I said earlier, I'm a big fan of having people in the system. You have to have 2 guys with keys, because you can't trust the computer system without the guys with the keys. And I mean, like I say, I think that the primary reason why we've had so few incidents with all these wells is we've got really, really good people working those wells. Not just running them, but in the design, that even though there are these fail-safes that have to be built in, that if it weren't for the teams of people in them working together as teams, that we wouldn't have corrected all the things that we had to correct on an hourly basis in order to keep all these things running all this time. So you're right, the behavioral psychologist is essential to predicting where those guys don't have the tools they need, when they're worked too hard to spot the next problem, when they're not given enough of a warning of a type of a risk. But if we give them the proper training and the proper knowledge and the proper assistance and the proper rotation, I'm a big fan of having people in that system, because that's what's kept it going.
We have time, I think, for one final question. Gentleman up here.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Martinez. I'm originally from Pensacola, Florida. I live in Little Rock now. As soon as the disaster happened, I started teaming up with Ricky Ott and a couple of other green kind of grassroots organizations that had just started because of the disaster. Working with them and talking to them, a lot of them have stated that what you see on TV, what you see in the media, is absolutely 180 degrees opposite of what's happening down on the scene. The use of dispersants hasn't really been talked about, and the human factor hasn't really been either. The health effects that are being affected now. I've seen fishermen and fishermen's wives, residents, cleanup workers, etc., with MRSA or MARSA, respiratory problems, chronic coughing, coughing up blood coming out of areas that I don't care to discuss publicly. They're also saying, these fishermen are also saying that they're still spraying now, to date. This was as of last week. And this has also been verified by a division head of a cleanup organization that's been subcontracted by BP. If the EPA sent out a directive saying you can't use it anymore, you have to stop using, that was what, June 19th? You have to drastically cut the amount that you're using, and they said, nah, not really. Until then, even after that had been, after that directive had been issued, they increased the amount of exceptions, the amount that they've been spraying. They quit warning the folks on the ground in the boats to where they've been sprayed. And overnight, these people are unhealthy. There's nothing to do to delist that dispersant specifically from EPA regulations. These regulations are set in stone. It's banned in 10 other countries, including the UK. Why are we using that here and not really looking at the human impact of things? People are getting sick now. How many more people have to be killed because of this? And that's a serious issue that needs to be taken into effect and taken effect now.
The ecotoxicity and human toxicity associated with the dispersants is very controversial, as you indicated, and not well documented. And because of, an EPA did initially prohibit the use of the dispersants, yet dispersants continue to be used. So you're right factually there too. I've worked in the oil patch. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I've worked around crude oil, a variety of types of crude oil. You've got organic solvents in liquid form and in volatile forms. You're in the middle of it. It's not a healthy place for people to be. You're absolutely correct. And if you have any you can exacerbate all sorts of things. I mean, the ecotoxicology associated with benzene alone, which is a class 1 carcinogen, is significant. So we understand that. The more sort of inflammatory characterizations, I can't respond to, because I don't understand exactly how you could quantify those in a meaningful and impactful way, except for to say we don't really know the impact of the dispersants. Personally, professionally, I would not have advocated the use of them because I don't think they do any good, and the perceived risk is probably greater than any benefit you would get from them, and under the circumstances they had. That's my personal and professional opinion. I wasn't asked, but.
Well, I mean, it's to anybody, but also Exxon Valdez-ville workers are experiencing the same thing 20 years later. They're still sick. You know, Merle Haggard is very sick. She's still struggling writing she just finished her book, and she's having a hard time breathing, and this is a continual thing. The studies should have been done then. This should have been done a very long time ago. We're in 2010. This is ridiculous.
That's a role of governance, and government acts at the will of the behest of the will of the people, and you have a voice in this government, thank goodness, so use it.
Thank you. It's a sign, I think, of the vitality and the success of this panel that the questions are still coming, and we could keep at it for quite a while. I'm sure folks are welcome to gather around and talk for a bit afterwards, but we need to draw this to a close. Dean Saxena, I want to, on behalf of the Honors College and the community, I want to thank the Dean for having the idea of this conference and pulling it together. We thank our three panelists.
Thank you to the panel.
Thanks to the panelists, and we are adjourned.